When my daughter got engaged, I signed over power of attorney for my late brother's oil royalties to my accountant, and I never told a living soul how much those checks were actually worth. It turned out to be the only reason I'm alive today, because exactly 9 days after the wedding, my new son-in-law showed up at my machine shop with a moving crew and a court order. What he tried to take from me, and what I found waiting for him instead, is something I still think about every single morning. If you've ever had someone you love look you dead in the eye and lie to your face, tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe family should never be allowed to underestimate you, hit that like button before we start, because you are not going to believe where this one ends up. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 68 years old, and I've spent 44 of those years running a small precision machine shop on the edge of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Briggs Tool and Die. My father started it in a cinder block building with 2 lathes and a dream, and I turned it into something that supplied parts to 3 different aerospace contractors before I quietly sold off the manufacturing contracts 11 years ago and kept just enough of the business running to look busy. To anyone driving past, it's a tired old shop with a leaky roof and a rusted sign. To me, it's the reason I never had to touch a penny of what my younger brother Samuel left me. Samuel died young, 41 years old, no wife, no kids, and a stake in 3 oil leases out in the Permian Basin that nobody in the family thought were worth much of anything back then. I was the only one who kept believing in him, the only one who drove out to sit with him during chemo, the only one he trusted enough to name in his will. When the leases started producing real money years later, I didn't tell anyone. Not my late wife, Carol, God rest her, not my daughter, Delilah, nobody. I let my accountant, a sharp, quiet woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, manage the royalty trust under a shell entity that had nothing that could be traced back to my name. I kept driving my '04 Silverado. I kept eating lunch out of a dented metal box. I wanted Delilah to know the value of $1 she earned herself, not one she was handed. Delilah is 29. She's my only child, and after Carol passed 6 years ago, she became the only person on this earth I loved without complication. So when she came home from Chicago last spring engaged to a man named Preston Vance, I wanted so badly to be happy for her that I ignored every single instinct screaming at me the moment I shook his hand. Preston had a firm handshake and a soft face, the kind of face that's been told its whole life. It's charming. He worked in what he called private capital allocation, which as far as I could tell meant he moved other people's money around and took a cut. He drove a leased German sedan he couldn't actually afford, wore a watch that cost more than my truck, and every time he looked around my shop, I saw him doing arithmetic behind his eyes, like he was pricing out the scrap metal. The wedding was small, just under the oak trees behind my house, the same spot where Carol and I got married 38 years earlier. Delilah looked so much like her mother that day I had to excuse myself twice just to stand alone by the fence line and get my breathing back under control. I walked her down the aisle. I gave a toast about hard work and honest love. I meant every word of it. I had no idea I was giving a toast at the opening ceremony of a war. 9 days later, on a Wednesday morning, I was in the back bay of the shop, replacing a worn bearing on my old Bridgeport mill, grease up to my elbows, radio playing low. I heard gravel crunching outside, more of it than usual, like several vehicles at once. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and walked out front to find a box truck backed up to my loading door, 2 men in matching polo shirts standing by the tailgate, and Preston stepping out of his sedan in a suit, sunglasses pushed up on his head, holding a leather folio against his chest like a shield. "Preston," I said, genuinely confused, wondering if maybe Delilah had asked him to pick something up. "What's all this?" He didn't answer right away. He walked toward me with the stiff, over-rehearsed posture of a man who'd practiced this moment in a mirror. He opened the folio and pulled out a thick stapled document, holding it out at arm's length like he didn't want to get too close to me. "Walter," he said, and I noticed he didn't call me Dad. Hadn't called me Dad since the wedding, actually. "This facility and the parcel it sits on have been transferred. I'm here with a court-approved conservatorship order. Delilah and I have been granted authority over your affairs, effective immediately." I actually laughed. I thought it was some kind of joke, maybe a prank Delilah had cooked up, though it didn't sound like her at all. Conservatorship. "Son, I run a business. I balance my own books." "What in the hell are you talking about?" His mouth twitched, somewhere between pity and irritation, the exact expression of a man who has decided you're already beneath his patience. There's documentation, Walter, from your physician regarding cognitive decline. Delilah's been very worried about you. We filed the petition 6 weeks ago. The judge granted it uncontested. Cognitive decline. I hadn't seen a doctor in 8 months, and the one time I had, it was for a torn rotator cuff. I felt the ground tilt slightly under my boots. My physician, I repeated. Which physician? Dr. Halbrook, Preston said, checking his folio like he needed the reminder. You saw him in March. I had never in my life heard the name Halbrook. I looked past Preston toward the 2 men by the truck, who were now unloading a handcart, clearly ready to start hauling out my equipment. I looked at the document in his hand. At the bottom of the 3rd page was a signature that looked, at a careless glance, almost exactly like mine. The same slant on the W, the same abrupt little hook I've put on the end of my last name since I was 17 years old, learning to sign invoices for my father. Almost exactly like mine. Except I had never signed anything for a doctor. Halbrook, and I sure as hell had never signed away control of a business that fed my family for 2 generations. Where's Delilah? I said, and my voice came out lower than I meant it to. She's at home. This has been very hard on her, Walter. Watching a parent decline isn't easy. I need you to understand this isn't personal. It's about your safety. He said it so smoothly, so rehearsed, that for one terrible second I almost believed he actually cared. Then he tapped the folio and said the words that told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man my daughter had married. The equipment in this facility has already been appraised. We're liquidating the machinery to consolidate your assets into a managed account for your protection. You have until Friday to remove any personal items that aren't part of the business inventory. 2 days. 44 years. And I had 2 days. I stood there on the concrete floor of my father's shop, a floor I'd poured fresh concrete over myself back in 1997, and I felt something crack open inside my chest that had nothing to do with fear. It was the same feeling I used to get right before I'd figure out why a machine was throwing a tolerance error. That cold, clean, focused stillness that comes right before your mind starts working the problem, instead of panicking about it. I told Preston I needed to review the paperwork with my own attorney before anyone touched a single machine, and to my mild surprise, he actually let me keep the document. Overconfidence, I'd learn later, was the one flaw Preston Vance could never manage to hide. He believed, completely, that a 68-year-old man who fixed lathes for a living wouldn't know how to fight back. He believed my quiet, plain life meant I was exactly what I looked like. He had no idea that the man standing in front of him controlled $94 million sitting in a trust he'd never once heard of, and that he had just made the single worst financial decision of his short, overconfident life. I drove home that afternoon, obeying every speed limit, hands steady on the wheel, my mind already 3 moves ahead. I did not call Delilah. Not yet. I needed to know first whether my daughter had actually believed I was losing my mind, or whether she was simply a passenger in something Preston had built without her. That night I called Priya. She picked up on the second ring, the way she always does, like she's been waiting by the phone her whole career for exactly this kind of call. "Walter," she said. "It's late. Everything all right?" "No," I said. "I need everything you have on Preston Vance. Everything. And I need you to find out who Dr. Halbrook is, because that man has apparently declared me mentally unfit, and I have never met him in my life." There was a pause on the line, the particular silence of a woman recalculating an entire evening. "Give me 48 hours, she said. I gave her 72. What Priya found in that time did more damage to Preston Vance than any lawsuit could have, because it wasn't built on accusation. It was built on paper, and paper doesn't lie the way people do. Preston Vance was not managing private capital. Preston Vance was underwater in nearly every direction a man can be underwater. He'd leveraged 3 separate margin accounts against a real estate syndication deal in Scottsdale that had collapsed the previous winter, a deal his own firm had quietly stopped listing on their internal reports 6 months before the wedding, meaning he'd known it was dying when he stood under those oak trees and promised to love and provide for my daughter. His firm had already flagged 2 client complaints for unauthorized trades. He owed back taxes on a condo he'd already sold. And buried in a filing from a private lending group out of Nevada was a $340,000 personal loan collateralized against something called anticipated spousal trust distribution, dated exactly 11 days before the wedding. He had gone looking for money before he ever said, "I do." He had married my daughter believing there was family wealth to be found, and when he didn't find it fast enough on his own, he'd manufactured a way to take my shop and whatever equity sat behind it, using a forged signature and, we would later learn, an actual doctor's office that Priya's investigator discovered was billing Medicare for patients who did not exist. Dr. Halbrook wasn't just willing to forge a diagnosis. He was already under quiet federal investigation for insurance fraud in 2 counties. Preston hadn't found a crooked doctor. He'd found a desperate one, and desperate people are cheap to buy. I sat in my study with all of it laid out across my desk, the same desk my father used to do payroll on, and I felt something I hadn't felt since the day we buried Carol. Not rage exactly. Something colder and more patient than rage. I decided I would not confront him with a phone call or a lawyer's letter. I would do what I've done my whole career when a machine is failing, and nobody can figure out why. I would take it apart, slow, piece by piece, in front of witnesses, until everybody in the room could see exactly where it broke, and exactly who broke it. The following Sunday, I did something Preston clearly hadn't planned for. I showed up at their apartment for what I let them believe was a confused, frightened old man coming to apologize and cooperate. I shuffled a little, going up their front walk. I let my hand tremble slightly when Delilah opened the door, and God, seeing her face soften with worry when she saw me, nearly broke my resolve right there on her welcome mat. She hugged me too tight and too long, and I understood in that hug that my daughter genuinely believed something was wrong with me. Preston had gotten to her first, and he'd gotten to her with love, which is the only weapon that ever really works on a person like Delilah. "Daddy," she said, and she hadn't called me that since she was maybe 12 years old. "I'm so glad you're not fighting this. Preston just wants what's best." I let her believe that for exactly as long as I needed to. I sat in their living room drinking decaf I didn't want, playing a slower, quieter version of myself, asking small, foolish questions, apologizing for being difficult, thanking Preston for handling everything so I wouldn't have to worry. And while Delilah went to the kitchen to refill my cup, I did what I came to do. I reached into my jacket and pressed a small recorder against the underside of their coffee table, the kind of device Priya's investigator uses for exactly this purpose. No bigger than a matchbook, magnetic backing, 48 hours of battery. On my way to their bathroom, feigning an old man's weak bladder, I left a second one taped behind the medicine cabinet mirror, close enough to catch anything said in their bedroom down the hall. I hated doing it. I want to say that plainly. There is nothing that felt good about planting listening devices in my own daughter's home. But I needed to know, with total certainty, whether Delilah was Preston's partner or Preston's next target, before I decided how much of my anger she deserved to inherit. I left that afternoon, still playing the trembling old fool, and Preston walked me all the way to my truck with his hand on my shoulder, the picture of a devoted son-in-law, and told me everything was going to be fine now that the family's assets were finally being protected properly. I thanked him. I meant it, in a way. He had just told me, in his own smug words, exactly what he believed he'd already won. 3 days later, Priya's contact retrieved both recorders. Most of what was on them was nothing. Dishwashers running, a television playing football, Delilah on the phone with a friend from college. But at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, the bedroom recorder caught the conversation that changed everything. It was Preston's voice first, tight and low. "The lending group is calling the note due in 3 weeks, D. 3 weeks. If we don't have movement on the shop liquidation by then, they're going to come after the condo, and after that they come after us." Delilah's voice, and I want you to understand what it cost me to listen to my own daughter's voice crack the way it did. "You told me my dad had early dementia. You told me the doctor confirmed it. Preston, was any of that real?" A long silence. Then Preston again, quieter, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. "Does it matter? He's 68, D. He's going to need help eventually anyway. I just moved the timeline up a little. This isn't about hurting him. This is about survival. My survival. Our survival. You want to spend your 30s visiting me in a cell because I couldn't cover a bridge loan. Or you want your father's dusty little machine shop to actually do something useful for once." And then my daughter, in a voice I will hear until the day I die, said, "I don't know who you are right now. That was the moment I understood Delilah wasn't my enemy. She was exactly what Preston had counted on her being: trusting, loyal, and completely unaware that her husband had built their entire marriage on a lie he was now willing to commit fraud against her own father to keep standing. I could have gone to her that night. Some part of me wanted to, but I've learned, across 44 years of watching machines fail, that if you intervene too early, you never actually find the root cause. You just patch the symptom and the whole thing breaks again somewhere else, usually worse. I needed Preston to keep pulling on the thread himself, all the way until it was too tight to hide anything. So I let the 48 hours count down. I let the liquidation appraiser walk through my shop with his clipboard. I shook his hand and called him sir, and let him believe I didn't understand what a single number on his sheet meant. And on Thursday night, I called Priya one final time and told her it was time to stop watching Preston Vance and start closing in on him. What Priya's team found in that final push was the piece that turned this from a family betrayal into a federal matter. Preston's Nevada lending group wasn't a lending group at all. It was a shell used by a man named Dominic Reyes, who 3 different state financial crimes units had already connected to a predatory lending ring targeting people exactly like Preston, over-leveraged finance professionals desperate enough to sign anything. The $340,000 loan came with an arrangement Preston had apparently agreed to in writing, and then panicked about the moment he realized what it meant. If the note wasn't repaid on schedule, Reyes's people would be entitled to collect against any liquid family assets identified in Preston's application, including, explicitly, in a clause Priya's forensic team found buried on page 11, my shop's real estate and any associated accounts held by relatives of the borrower's spouse. Preston hadn't just forged documents to steal from me. He had put my daughter's father up as collateral to a loan shark, using a corrupt doctor to legally justify stripping me of my rights, all so he could make a payment to a man who did not forgive missed deadlines. When Priya laid that timeline out for me across 2 pages of typed summary, my hands actually went cold reading it. This wasn't greed anymore. This was a man who had, whether he'd admit it to himself or not, put a target on my back to save his own skin. Friday morning came. The eviction deadline Preston had given me. I woke up before sunrise, put on the good gray suit I hadn't worn since Carol's funeral, and drove to the shop one last time as its sole, undisputed owner. Priya was already there when I arrived, standing beside 2 men I didn't immediately recognize, and a woman in a windbreaker with FBI stenciled across the back in small block letters. It turned out the Reyes lending operation had already been under federal investigation for 11 months, and my daughter's forged conservatorship documents, discovered in the middle of an unrelated wire fraud case, had just become the piece that let agents finally connect Reyes directly to a licensed financial advisor willing to defraud a client's own family. Priya, it turned out, hadn't just been gathering evidence for me. She'd been quietly feeding pieces of what she found to a federal contact for the past week. Once she understood what she was actually looking at, Preston arrived at 9 sharp, right on schedule, with his moving crew and his liquidation folder, expecting to find a confused old man ready to hand over the keys. Instead, he found me standing in the open bay doors in Carol's favorite gray suit, flanked by a forensic accountant who had spent 11 days dismantling his entire financial life, and 2 federal agents holding a folder considerably thicker than his. I watched the exact moment his face changed. It's a specific kind of collapse. The look of a man realizing the story he's been telling himself for weeks was never actually true. His eyes went from me to Priya, to the agents, and back to me, and I saw him do the math, the same arithmetic I'd watched him run behind his eyes back at the wedding, except this time the number coming back to him was his own ruin. "Walter," he started. "I can explain." "You already did," I said. "About 3 weeks ago, in your bedroom, to my daughter. I have never in my life watched a grown man's legs actually go weak. Not until that moment." Delilah pulled into the lot right then, unaware, thinking she was coming to help her husband finish a routine business matter, and she got out of her car just in time to watch the agent step forward with a warrant naming both Preston and Dr. Halbrook, and to hear one of them read Preston his rights while he stood frozen in front of the shop his own family built. My daughter looked at me across that gravel lot, and I watched 44 years of trust I'd spent my whole life building finally do the only job it was ever meant to do. She didn't ask me if it was true. She didn't defend him. She walked straight past Preston, straight past the agents, and put her arms around me, and I felt her whole body shaking. "He told me you were sick," she said into my shoulder. "He told me we were protecting you." "I know, baby girl," I said. "I know you believed him. That's not a crime." "Believing your husband isn't a crime." Preston tried one more time as they walked him toward the car, twisting in the agent's grip to look back at me. "You could have just told me about the trust, Walter. None of this had to happen. We're family." I let that sit in the cold morning air for a moment before I answered him. Family doesn't forge a doctor's signature to steal a man's life's work. Family doesn't put its own father-in-law up as collateral to a loan shark to save its own skin. You didn't marry into my family, son. You audited it. And you failed. They put him in the car. Dr. Halbrook was picked up separately that same afternoon, and it came out over the following weeks that he'd been running the same scheme for at least 4 other families before mine. Elderly parents diagnosed with conditions they never had. Also, someone standing to inherit could seize control a little faster than the law or decency would otherwise allow. Preston pled guilty 8 months later to wire fraud and forgery in exchange for cooperation against Reyes's lending operation, and the judge, unmoved by his lawyer's talk of financial desperation, gave him 6 years. Delilah filed for annulment before Preston's first court date. She moved back into the little house I've kept since Carol passed. "Just for a few months," she said, "though it's been almost a year now, and neither of us has brought up her leaving again. She works 3 days a week now, doing the books for the shop. Actually doing them. Real work. The kind Carol always hoped she'd find pride in. I finally told her about the trust, all $94 million of it, sitting quiet the whole time behind a shell entity and a woman named Priya, who I now trust with more than my money. Delilah cried for an hour, not about the number, she told me later, but about every year she thought I was struggling alone and never once asked her for help. I still go into the shop most mornings. I still fix what's broken with my own 2 hands when I can. The money hasn't changed how I live. Not really. Though I did finally replace the roof, and I set up a fund in Samuel's name for young men going through what he went through, so his name means something more than the leases he left behind. Family is supposed to be the one place you never have to prove your worth. But I learned something at 68 years old that I wish I'd understood 40 years earlier. Love makes people careless about who they let sit at their table, and desperation will make even someone who once meant those vows turn a father-in-law's whole life into collateral. My silence never came from foolishness. It came from wanting my daughter to build something real, on her own, without a number hanging over every decision she made. Preston mistook my quiet life for weakness. He mistook an old man's patience for an old man's confusion. That was the last mistake he ever got to make on my watch. If somebody you loved ever looked you in the eye and tried to convince you that you were the one losing your grip on reality, I want you to know you're not alone, and I want you to know that patience, real patience, the kind that waits and watches and gathers proof instead of screaming into the wind, is still the sharpest tool any of us will ever own. Tell me down in the comments if you've ever had to prove your own family wrong about who you really are. I read every single one of them. Take care of yourselves out there, and I'll see you in the next story.